Sup guys? In this video, I'm going to share some stuff that I've tested that aren't super meta relevant, so I don't think I need to go too in depth with each thing. I'll also take the opportunity to update some of my takes or respond to some comments that could be relevant. Alright, to start off, I've already added Moskva to my Vanguard tier list because her power level can be pretty straightforwardly deduced from her stats and barrage numbers. Like I said in the event breakdown, she basically combines the damage of Hindenburg and the survivability of Napoli, and also enables Nakhimov by herself. I think she'll at least be in front of Plymouth by virtue of being tankier and outputting more damage, and against medium armor, the premier fleet of Soyuz, Nakhimov, and Fritz Rumey has Soyuz as the flagship, but her personal damage isn't that high when used in carrier buffer mode, so Plymouth's buff isn't as effective. She'll also be much more consistent than Plymouth as a main tank, so you can run two purely damage-focused ships in your other Vanguard slots, resulting in even greater gains in total damage in places where Plymouth is just not tanky enough to main tank reliably. I still have her behind these three destroyers since they provide things like anti-sub and anti-air, which Moskva doesn't for the most part, but for bossing specifically, especially against medium armor, I wouldn't be surprised to see Moskva steal even Z-52 spot in some fleets. This is how I'm choosing to order them based on what I value. I don't spend too much time in chapters 15 and 16 past clearing them, so Laffy is perhaps lower than what other players might view her. These comments brought up the possibility of using Nakhimov with Moskva to set up for Hakuho and Amagi for a heavy armor boss fight. While this is a valid option, it's not without its drawbacks. Moskva's damage output isn't stellar against heavy, and the same goes for Nakhimov in the current year. For Moskva, since she's a gunboat, her damage output is probably going to be less than Z-52's damage output when considering her 5% extra damage taken debuff, which affects the main fleet as well. Using Nakhimov over Shinano will result in a huge damage loss, which might be necessary if a route is absolutely needed, but it might also not be. You can still use Implacable over Nakhimov, for example, and then the Vanguard could consist of Z-52, Kazagumo, and Unzen, all of which likely contribute more damage than Moskva to make up for Implacable's lower damage compared to Nakhimov. And you can also consider using a battleship with the IJN carriers, for example Line, just to enable Trafalgar's evasion rate debuff. Since there are real trade-offs, although she is very strong, she's not really a Z-52 or Trafalgar level release, where she's an immediate shoo-in to most bossing fleet compositions. Currently, I think the only place where she is highly likely to find a spot would be against medium armor, in which case there isn't much of a reason to run Nakhimov without Soyuz, although Line, for instance, could potentially be stronger. This could change with a few more new ships though. Next, I want to give a little update on Georgia. Her damage actually does match Warspite's when against enemies where her bonus damage works, but only if you use her as the flagship. The golden shower portion of her barrage that fires the small shells is unaimed and fires directly in front of her, and the difference between it hitting and not hitting does make up the difference between her damage and Warspite's. When Georgia was first released in PR2, battleships with aimed barrages that could be used off-flag were quite rare, and it was a very desirable trait. Georgia was one of those ships who could be used off-flag without losing nearly as much as others like Monarch, so she had that going for her. These days though, barely any of the best battleships care for the flagship position in isolation, so it's pretty reasonable to give her the flagship position to squeeze out the most damage possible. Depending on the other ships in your fleet though, for example, if you have Plymouth, you might want to put your strongest battleship in the flagship position, which might not be Georgia. Or if you're using Trafalgar or Eldridge, you want your flagship to fire first to apply their debuffs for the other ships, but Georgia with her relatively low reload might not be the best for that. I tested her along Warspite on the release of her unique augment just to save time, and I had her as the off-flag because I thought she could go off-flag, since that was her role back in the day. And also, Warspite has much higher reload, so I could apply Eldridge's slow for both of them by using Warspite as the flagship. But as a result, Georgia did lose some damage from her barrage. Testing them separately with the same equipment as before, Georgia's damage is essentially the same as Warspite's against a medium armor battlecruiser like Nasino meta. She did do a bit more on average, but the margin is small, and with such a low sample size, I can't flat out say that she's definitely stronger. Also, with Nasino being an older meta fight, her evasion is on the low side, so Warspite doesn't get as much of an advantage with her much higher accuracy. So, in terms of her personal damage, it should be on par with Warspite against most medium and heavy enemies if she can take the flagship position, which is also higher than New Jersey's personal damage against those enemies, but against light armor she's pretty useless. New Jersey still brings her armor break debuff, small buffs for USS ships, and her barrage applies a much more powerful burn, which is relevant when all the battleships in the fleet are using AP ammo, so she's overall a better pick, but damage-wise, Georgia can definitely hang in a lot of cases. Although her damage is solid, she's still lacking in some areas, like light armor damage and low reload, and also hogging up the flagship slot, so I think putting her in A tier, which is the same as Dyson, is reasonable. Next up is Baltimore. She's one of my favorites, so I had to give her a shot when she got her unique augment. I was interested to see if she could be a niche option for battleship fleets against medium armor, with her improved damage and unique shelling debuff, but even in the best conditions, her damage contribution was below that of Hindenburg and Guam. You can still use her for that if you don't have Hindenburg or Guam, but there are more options like Moskva, Z-52, Plymouth, and so on. It's hard to use her as a carrier buffer because the USS carriers she buffs are best against light armor, where she's not that great herself. It's kinda serviceable, but far from being the best there due to her lack of personal damage. The USS carriers aren't that special against medium armor, and Baltimore isn't going to change that either. Against heavy armor, you're still better off using torpedoes for the most part. I kinda wish that they could have doubled down on her identity as a carrier buffer instead of buffing her damage and armor break debuff, since to me, that's mostly what made her unique. That way she could have had some interesting niche uses instead of being just meh at both buffing USS carriers and being a damage dealer. The last ship I want to cover is Vittorio Cuniberti. I kinda just wrote her off on release because her stats were nothing special, and her barrage numbers were kinda misleading if you don't read the fine print. I thought it was just another Halford incident, although not to the same extent. When she received her skin recently though, I became a fan and had to give her a proper spin. By the way, cat girls are better than bunny girls. Bunny girls are not bad, but the order is definitely cat girls, then fox girls, and then bunny girls. If you just look at her barrage's base damage, it just looks like an underwhelming 200-ish damage barrage every time she fires her torpedoes, but she actually deploys the exhaust haze repeatedly over 3 seconds, triggering the barrage a total of 6 times, meaning the base damage of this barrage is actually about 1200, which is already pretty good, but it doesn't end there. Since it's repeated 6 times, it can potentially hit 36 times, triggering the other barrage twice, which is a total of 1000 base damage torpedo barrage, backed by her torpedo stat, which is much higher than her firepower stat. Back to the base barrage. It doesn't say anywhere that it is targeted, but what it seems to do is, once it is fired, it finds a target and stays on the field indefinitely until it hits that target, and if the target just happens to sit in a position where the arc can't make a sharp enough turn to reach them, it will just spin indefinitely, trapping the enemy in a deadly vortex. Practically speaking, this thing is guaranteed to physically find the enemy at some point, unless the battle ends before it reaches them, so hitting 30 times and triggering the torpedo barrage twice is just a matter of whether 30 out of the 36 shots pass the accuracy check. I briefly tested her out against ships I had in B tier in the past, like Kawakaze Meta and Felix Schultz, against a medium armor meta boss since her modifiers are skewed toward only medium armor. She surprisingly ended up beating out both of them, which is pretty impressive considering Kawakaze Meta's damage is no joke, and Felix Schultz was a very solid ship around the time of her release. While the barrage is guaranteed to land, she doesn't have any AoE or piercing damage, so she has no advantage against multiple enemies like in campaign, and her damage isn't great outside of medium armor. So even though her damage against medium armor is very respectable, her use cases are very limited. Still, she's definitely no Halford on release. I would say she's on the higher end for gold destroyers, but since we have so many rainbow destroyers now, it's pretty hard to stand out even as a good SSR destroyer. I also did briefly test out Dmitry Donskoy, but there's nothing really there. Her damage output is around Neptune level, and her survivability is even worse. In exchange, she gets a very minor AP damage debuff that doesn't really do enough to make her relevant. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.